$38 trillion, not 36. The title is already outdated. In November 2024, the United States national debt crossed $36 trillion. By October 2025, it had reached $38 trillion. And by the time you finish listening to this, it will be higher still. The debt grows by approximately $1 trillion every 90 days. That is $11 billion per day, $460 million per hour, $7.7 million per minute. Thanks for watching, and to Alactu and R something, in a minute again. $38 trillion is a number so large, it defies human comprehension. If you stacked 38 trillion $1 bills, the stack would reach 25,000 miles into space beyond where satellites orbit. If you spent $1 million every single day, it would take you 104,000 years to spend 38 trillion. That is longer than modern humans have existed as a species. Would be. And expect to R here is the practed the smalses. The person R here's a work, but here's the number that makes it real. $111,000. That is your share of the national debt. Every man, woman, and child in America owes $111,000 before they have borrowed a single dollar themselves. A family of 4 owes $444,000. That is more than the median home price in most American cities. You are born into debt. Your children are born into debt. And their children will be born into even more debt. In the back slide 5. This is the Marison and Go. We're now, wording tentering, we're now, wording to see. This is not an accounting abstraction. This is not a government balance sheet problem that economists will solve. This is theft. Someone stole $38 trillion, and you are going to pay it back with interest. The interest is where the crime becomes undeniable. In fiscal year 2024, the United States government paid $881 billion in interest on the national debt. In fiscal year 2025, that number reached $952 billion. In fiscal year 2026, it will exceed $1 trillion for the first time in history. The first 9 weeks of fiscal year 2026 alone saw $104 billion paid in interest. That is $11 billion per week, $1.6 billion per day, $66 million per hour. So, it have not rated a fine at a Dockers. $1 trillion in annual interest payments means the government pays $7,800 per household every single year just to service the debt, not to reduce it, not to pay it off, just to pay the interest. That is more than the entire budget of Medicare, more than the national defense budget of $800 billion. And by 2035, interest payments will reach $1.8 trillion annually. Within 15 years, interest on the debt will be the second largest item in the federal budget, exceeded only by Social Security. Who receives this $1 trillion in interest? Foreign governments hold approximately 34% of U.S. debt: China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and others. That means $340 billion per year flows out of America to foreign bondholders. Wealthy Americans and financial institutions hold most of the rest. The top 10% of wealth holders own 90% of bonds. This means $1 trillion per year is being transferred from middle-class taxpayers to wealthy bondholders and foreign governments, every year, forever, or until the system collapses. This is not debt in the traditional sense. Debt implies intention to repay. Debt implies productive investment that will generate returns to cover repayment. Debt implies mutual agreement between borrower and lender. The $38 trillion national debt has none of these characteristics. There is no plan to repay it. No politician in either party has proposed a budget that would even stabilize the debt, let alone reduce it. The trajectory is for debt to reach $40 trillion by the end of 2026, $50 trillion by 2030, and $60 trillion or more by 2035. There is no investment generating returns. $38 trillion was not borrowed to build infrastructure that produces revenue, or fund education that increases productivity, or finance research that creates industries. It was borrowed to fund current consumption wars, tax cuts, subsidies, bailouts that provided benefits to one generation and passed costs to the next. And there is no mutual agreement. The people who will pay this debt, Millennials, Gen Z, and those not yet born, never consented to it. They could not vote when the borrowing occurred. Many were not alive. They are inheriting $111,000 in debt per person from decisions made by previous generations who will not live to see the consequences. This is why the title uses the word heist. A heist is not borrowing. A heist is taking something that does not belong to you with no intention of returning it. A heist enriches the perpetrators while leaving victims to discover the loss later. A heist is a crime, and $38 trillion represents the largest heist in human history. The question is not whether a heist occurred. The evidence is published by the U.S. Treasury. updated daily, undeniable. The question is, who did it? Who looted America's future? Who are the perpetrators of this $38 trillion crime? Over the next 40 minutes, we are going to name them. We are going to trace exactly where $38 trillion went. And we are going to show you what happens when the victims, your children, your grandchildren, every American born after 1990 finally discover what was stolen from them. This is the story of the greatest theft in history. And unlike most heists, this one is perfectly legal, fully documented, and still ongoing. When you ask who looted $38 trillion, the answer is uncomfortable because the perpetrators are not a secret cabal. They are elected officials, Federal Reserve governors, interest groups, and most uncomfortably, the American voters themselves. Let us start with the most visible perpetrators, the bipartisan political class that has governed America for the past 45 years. In 1981, when Ronald Reagan took office, the national debt stood at approximately $1 trillion. Reagan campaigned on the idea that tax cuts would unleash economic growth that would generate enough revenue to eliminate the deficit and eventually pay off the debt entirely. He cut the top income tax rate from 70% to 28%. He increased defense spending dramatically to win the Cold War, and he promised to cut domestic spending to offset both. By the time Reagan left office in 1989, the debt had nearly tripled to $2.9 trillion. The tax cuts happened. The defense increases happened. The domestic spending cuts did not. George H.W. Bush inherited $2.9 trillion in debt and left $4.4 trillion 4 years later. He famously promised, read my lips, no new taxes, and then broke that promise by signing a modest tax increase. Voters punished him with electoral defeat. The lesson was learned. Politicians who raise taxes lose. Politicians who borrow to avoid raising taxes stay in office. Bill Clinton, working with a Republican Congress, came closest to fiscal responsibility. By his final years in office, the federal government was running small surpluses. The debt stopped growing. For a brief moment, there was talk of paying it off entirely within 15 years. Then came the 2000 election. George W. Bush inherited $5.8 trillion in debt. He cut taxes dramatically $1.3 trillion over 10 years. He launched wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, funded entirely through borrowing eventually $2 trillion for Iraq and $2.3 trillion for Afghanistan. He added Medicare Part D prescription drug coverage $500 billion unfunded. He bailed out banks during the 2008 financial crisis, $700 billion in TARP alone. When Bush left office in January 2009, the debt had reached $11.9 trillion. He had doubled it in 8 years. Barack Obama took office during the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The deficit was already $1.4 trillion when he was inaugurated. The bills for Bush's final year were coming due and tax revenue had collapsed. Obama authorized an $800 billion stimulus, continued the wars, implemented the Affordable Care Act, and extended most of Bush's tax cuts. By the time he left office in 2017, the debt stood at $20 trillion. He had added $8 trillion in 8 years. Donald Trump campaigned, promising to eliminate the national debt in 8 years through economic growth. Instead, he added $7 trillion in 4 years. He signed tax cuts, costing $1.5 trillion over 10 years, most of the benefits going to corporations and the wealthy. He increased defense spending. He did not touch Social Security or Medicare, despite both being on unsustainable paths. And when COVID-19 hit in 2020, he authorized trillions in emergency spending. By the time Trump left office in January 2021, the debt had reached $27 trillion. Joe Biden continued the COVID spending through 2021 and 2022. He signed infrastructure legislation, student loan forgiveness initiatives, and continued increased discretionary spending. When the debt crossed $36 trillion in November 2024, Biden had added $9 trillion in 4 years. The pattern is undeniable. Every administration since 1980, Republican and Democrat, with the sole exception of Clinton's final years, has increased the debt. Every single one. Republicans cut taxes without cutting spending. Democrats increased spending without raising taxes enough to pay for it. Both refuse to touch Social Security and Medicare, which together consume 65% of the federal budget. Both fund defense increases. And both borrow to avoid the political pain of hard choices. This is not partisan. This is bipartisan theft. Democrats and Republicans collaborated to loot $38 trillion from future generations. Thanks for watching. But politicians could not have accomplished this heist without an accomplice, the Federal Reserve. In 2008, when the financial crisis hit, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet stood at $900 billion. That represented the total amount of assets, mostly Treasury bonds, that the Fed held. Then came quantitative easing, QE1, QE2, QE3. The Federal Reserve created trillions of dollars out of nothing and used that money to purchase treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. By 2014, the Fed's balance sheet had reached $4.5 trillion. The Fed had created $3.6 trillion to support markets and enable government borrowing. In March 2020, when COVID-19 crashed markets, the Fed launched the largest quantitative easing program in history. Within 18 months, the Fed's balance sheet grew from $4 trillion to $9 trillion. $5 trillion created from nothing. As of early 2026, the balance sheet stands at approximately $7 trillion after modest reduction. Why does this matter? Because when the Federal Reserve buys treasury bonds with newly created money, it enables the government to borrow without facing market constraints. In a normal market, as debt grows, lenders demand higher interest rates to compensate for increased risk. Higher rates force governments to either cut spending or raise taxes. The pain becomes immediate and political action becomes necessary. But when the Fed steps in and buys bonds with created money, interest rates stay artificially low. The government can borrow more and more without immediate consequence. The discipline of markets is removed. The Federal Reserve did not force the government to borrow $38 trillion, but they made it possible. They printed the money that financed the deficits. And they did so knowing the cost would be borne not by the current generation, but by future generations through inflation and debt servicing. Inflation is a hidden tax. When the Fed creates $5 trillion in 2 years, the money supply increases 40%. The number of goods and services does not increase 40%. More money chasing the same goods means prices rise. From 2021 to 2023, Americans experienced inflation rates not seen in 4 decades, peaking at 9%. Groceries doubled in price, rent increased 30 to 50%. Gas hit $5 per gallon. This was not random. This was the direct consequence of money printing to finance government spending. Who benefits from inflation? The government, which repays debt in devalued currency. Asset owners, the top 10% who own stocks and real estate, whose assets inflate in price along with the money supply. Who pays? Savers, whose cash loses purchasing power. Workers, whose wages lag inflation. Retirees on fixed incomes. The middle class. The Federal Reserve enabled the heist and then extracted payment through the inflation tax. But politicians and the Fed could not loot $38 trillion without demand for that spending. And the demand came from interest groups that profit from government expenditure. Defense contractors spend over $100 million annually lobbying for increased military budgets. The result, $800 billion per year in defense spending, more than the next 10 countries combined. Weapons systems the military does not want. Aircraft carriers costing $13 billion each. The F-35 fighter program with a lifetime cost of $1.7 trillion. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan costing a combined $5 trillion when you include interest and long-term veteran care. All of it borrowed. All of it enriching Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman. All of it added to the debt that future taxpayers must service. The healthcare industry ensures that Medicare and Medicaid spending grows faster than the economy. Pharmaceutical companies lobby against drug price negotiations. Hospitals charge 2 to 3 times the prices of comparable procedures in Europe. Insurance companies profit from government spending. The result? $1.5 trillion annually in Medicare and Medicaid costs, growing 6 to 7% per year, while GDP grows 2 to 3%. The gap widens, the debt grows. Senior citizen lobbying groups, particularly AARP, with its 38 million members, fiercely protect Social Security and Medicare from any reform. Seniors vote at 70% rates compared to 50% for the population overall. Any politician who proposes raising the retirement age or means testing benefits faces attack ads featuring grandmothers being pushed off cliffs. The result? Entitlement spending untouchable, deficit structural, debt inevitable. Corporate interests lobby for bailouts when their industries fail. Banks in 2008 received $700 billion in TARP funds plus trillions more in Federal Reserve emergency lending. Airlines in 2020 received $50 billion in COVID relief, despite having spent billions on stock buybacks in the previous 5 years. The pattern is consistent. Privatize profits when times are good, socialize losses when times are bad. Borrow from taxpayers to rescue corporations. Add to debt. But the most uncomfortable truth is this. American voters demanded this spending. Polls consistently show 70% of Americans oppose cutting Social Security, 70% oppose cutting Medicare, 60% support strong military spending, 50% want lower taxes, 60% want more infrastructure and education spending. The math does not work. You cannot have large government, strong defense, generous entitlements, and low taxes without massive borrowing. But voters demand exactly that combination, and politicians who tell the truth lose elections. Paul Ryan proposed Medicare reform in 2012. Democrats ran ads showing a Paul Ryan lookalike pushing a grandmother in a wheelchair off a cliff. Ryan's ticket lost the presidential election. George H.W. Bush raised taxes modestly in 1990 to address deficits. He lost re-election. The lesson is clear. Fiscal responsibility is political suicide. Borrowing is political survival. Voters are not innocent victims of this heist. They are participants. They vote for politicians who promise benefits without costs. They demand spending they are unwilling to fund through taxes. They consume today and pass the bill to their children tomorrow. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable perpetrator of all, the baby boom generation. Born between 1946 and 1964, boomers are the largest and wealthiest generation in American history. They voted for tax cuts in the 1,980 seconds, 2000s, and 2010 seconds, cuts they enjoyed during their peak earning years. They voted for wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, wars their children fought while they paid no war tax. They voted for Medicare Part D prescription drug coverage, an unfunded $500 billion benefit they now collect. They voted for politicians who promised never to touch Social Security benefits they are now receiving in full. Boomers voted themselves trillions in benefits, borrowed to pay for them, and will die before the debt becomes mathematically unsustainable. They extracted approximately $10 to $15 trillion more in lifetime benefits than they paid in taxes. And they leave the bill $38 trillion and growing to Millennials, Gen Z, and all future Americans. This is generational theft, and it is the core of the heist. The perpetrators will not face consequences. They will die comfortable, their Social Security checks arriving until their final breath. The victims, those born after 1980, will spend their entire working lives paying interest on debt they did not create, funding benefits they will not receive, and inheriting an economy crippled by obligations made before they could vote. $38 trillion was looted by politicians seeking re-election, enabled by a Federal Reserve printing money, demanded by interest groups extracting profits, voted for by citizens wanting benefits without costs, and ultimately transferred from young to old in the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in history. These are the perpetrators, and now we must examine exactly how they executed the heist. The $38 trillion heist was not a single act. It was executed through 4 mechanisms, each perfectly legal, each politically popular, and each transferring wealth from the future to the present. Mechanism 1. Spend without taxing. The formula is simple and politically irresistible. Politician A campaigns on the following platform: I will give you benefits, healthcare, education, infrastructure, and I will cut your taxes. Politician B, the fiscally responsible opponent, campaigns on this platform: I will ask you to sacrifice. We must cut spending or raise taxes to balance the budget. Voters choose Politician A in a landslide. Politician A takes office, delivers the benefits, cuts the taxes, and borrows the difference. Deficit explodes. But Politician A gets credit for the benefits and credit for the tax cuts. The debt is invisible. The next election, Politician A campaigns on their record of delivery. They win again. This has been the pattern for 45 years. In 2001, George W. Bush signed tax cuts totaling $1.3 trillion over 10 years. The top rate dropped from 39.6% to 35%. Estate taxes were reduced. Capital gains and dividend taxes were cut. The tax cuts were sold as economic stimulus that would pay for themselves through growth. They did not. Federal revenue as a percentage of GDP fell from 20.6% to 16.1%. At the same time, Bush launched wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, added Medicare Part D, and increased education and domestic spending. All of it borrowed. Not $1 of war spending was paid for through taxes or offsetting cuts. The entire $5 trillion over 20 years went onto the national debt. Thanks for watching. This is Applied 9 and 5. I as Plighted 9 and 9. In 2017, Donald Trump signed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, $1.5 trillion in tax cuts over 10 years. The corporate rate dropped from 35% to 21%. Individual rates declined. Estate tax exemptions doubled. The bill was sold under the banner of dynamic scoring, the claim that growth from tax cuts would generate enough revenue to offset the cost. It did not. Revenue as a percentage of GDP fell again. And this time, the economy was not in recession. Unemployment was low, growth was steady. There was no crisis justifying borrowing. Yet, the deficit topped $1 trillion in 2019, before COVID. The tax cuts transferred $1.5 trillion from future taxpayers to current taxpayers, with 83% of long-term benefits going to the top 1%. Every major tax cut since 1980 has followed the same pattern. Reagan's cuts in 1981 and 1986, Bush's cuts in 2001 and 2003, Trump's cuts in 2017. All promised to pay for themselves. None did. All added trillions to the debt. All benefited disproportionately the wealthy, who captured 60 to 85% of the value. And all were popular. Because people like lower taxes, they like them so much they are willing to ignore the debt their children will inherit. The spending side followed the same logic. In 2003, Congress passed Medicare Part D, adding prescription drug coverage for seniors. The benefit was real and popular. But it added $500 billion in unfunded obligations. There was no corresponding tax increase, no offsetting cut to other programs. The benefit was delivered to current seniors. The bill was passed to future taxpayers. This is the definition of looting: taking benefits now, passing costs later. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost $5 trillion when you include interest payments and long-term veteran care. Not $1 was funded through a war tax. During World War II, Americans bought war bonds and paid higher taxes to fund the conflict. During Vietnam, there was a war surtax. But during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the longest in American history, there were no new taxes. Instead, taxes were cut. The entire cost was borrowed. Soldiers fought. Contractors profited. Future taxpayers got the bill. This is mechanism 1. Deliver benefits today, borrow to pay for them, pass the debt to those too young to vote against it. Over $38 trillion, approximately $6 trillion, can be traced directly to tax cuts that primarily benefited the wealthy, and another $8 trillion to wars and military spending funded entirely through borrowing. $14 trillion of the heist came from spending without taxing. Mechanism 2. Print money to enable borrowing. When a government borrows in a normal market, it must find willing lenders. Those lenders demand interest rates that reflect risk. As debt grows, risk increases, and interest rates rise. High rates create pain. They force governments to either cut spending or raise taxes. The market imposes discipline, but the Federal Reserve removed that discipline. Here's how it works technically. The government needs $1 trillion more than it collects in taxes. The Treasury issues $1 trillion in bonds, promises to repay with interest over 10 or 30 years. Those bonds are auctioned. Normally, investors, pension funds, foreign governments, wealthy individuals would buy them. But if there is insufficient demand, prices fall and interest rates rise. A 30-year bond might have to offer 8% instead of 4% to attract buyers. That doubling of interest costs would force the government to reconsider the spending. But the Federal Reserve steps in. The Fed announces it will purchase Treasury bonds as part of quantitative easing, a term invented to obscure money printing. The Fed creates reserves out of nothing, literally typing numbers into a computer, and uses those reserves to buy the Treasury bonds. The Treasury receives $1 trillion. The Fed holds $1 trillion in bonds backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. New money has been created, the money supply has increased, and the government has borrowed without market constraint. From 2008 to 2014, the Fed created $3.6 trillion this way. From 2020 to 2022, another $5 trillion. In total, the Fed expanded its balance sheet from $900 billion in 2008 to over $9 trillion at the peak. That is more than $8 trillion created from nothing to enable government borrowing. Why is this a heist? Because printing money is a hidden tax. When you double the money supply without doubling the goods and services in the economy, prices rise. That is inflation. And inflation is a wealth transfer from those holding cash to those holding real assets. From 2021 to 2023, the United States experienced inflation peaking at 9%, the highest in 40 years. Groceries that cost $100 in 2020 cost $125 by 2023. Rent increased 30 to 50%. Gas doubled. This palatable into the honors. So it is one reason, Luke. Who paid this inflation tax? Workers, whose wages lagged price increases by 2 to 3 years. Savers, whose cash lost 20 to 30% of purchasing power. Retirees on fixed incomes, whose Social Security checks could no longer cover expenses. The middle class. Who benefited? The government, which borrowed trillions and repays in devalued dollars. The wealthy, who owned stocks and real estate that appreciated with the money supply. Stocks tripled, housing doubled. The Fed enabled the government to borrow $8 trillion more than it could have in an honest market, and then extracted payment through the inflation tax that destroyed middle-class savings. This is mechanism 2. Remove market discipline through money printing, enable unlimited borrowing, extract payment through hidden inflation. Another $8 trillion of the heist came from Federal Reserve money creation. Mechanism 3. Defer costs to the future. Fiscal policy is conducted in present-day dollars but evaluated over decades. This creates the opportunity for temporal theft, taking benefits now, passing costs to those not yet able to object. Consider the Iraq War. Launched in 2003, it cost $800 billion in direct spending through 2011. But the total cost, including interest on the borrowed money and long-term veteran care, exceeds $3 trillion and will be paid through 2050 and beyond. The soldiers who fought were disproportionately young, average age 21. Many were not old enough to vote when the war was authorized. The politicians who voted for it were disproportionately old, average age 60. The young fought. The old voted. And the costs will be paid by the children of the soldiers, people not yet born when the war began. This is theft across time. Medicare and Social Security represent the largest temporal theft. Both systems were structured as pay-as-you-go. Current workers pay taxes to fund current retirees. This works when demographics are favorable, many workers supporting few retirees. But baby boomers, the largest generation in history, voted throughout their working lives for benefit increases and tax cuts. They increased Social Security cost of living adjustments. They added Medicare Part D prescription coverage. They cut payroll taxes temporarily. And now they are retiring $10,000 per day from 2011 to 2030. The Social Security Trust Fund will be depleted by 2033. At that point, incoming taxes will cover only 75% of promised benefits. The choice will be cut benefits 25%, raise payroll taxes 25%, or borrow trillions more. Boomers will have collected full benefits for over 20 years by then. Millennials and Gen Z will face either cuts or massive tax increases to cover the shortfall. I want a dude with manners basically 5'7" description. With manners 7 descriptions with 3 with manners basically. The generational accounting is stark. Boomers, on average, will receive $10 to $15 trillion more in lifetime government benefits than they paid in taxes. Gen X will roughly break even. Millennials and Gen Z will pay $5 to $10 trillion more in taxes than they receive in benefits. The transfer is direct and measurable. Old, looted from young. This was not accidental. It was structural. A generation votes for benefits during their working years, collects those benefits during retirement, and dies before the bills come due. Perfect crime. The perpetrators are gone. The victims cannot retaliate. This is mechanism 3. Temporal theft across generations. Approximately $10 trillion of the $38 trillion debt represents intergenerational transfer, primarily from boomers voting themselves benefits that millennials and Gen Z will pay for. Where that were 4-digit example.com into the barred one, where subscribe devi, one way, mechanism 4, socialize costs, privatize benefits. The 2008 financial crisis cost American households $11 trillion in lost wealth. Home values collapsed. Retirement accounts lost half their value. 9 million people lost their homes to foreclosure. Unemployment reached 10%. But the banks that caused the crisis through fraudulent lending, reckless leverage, and securities fraud were not allowed to fail. The federal government authorized $700 billion in TARP funds to bail out banks. The Federal Reserve provided trillions more in emergency lending. Citigroup received $45 billion. Bank of America received $45 billion. AIG received $182 billion. The justification was that these institutions were too big to fail. If they collapsed, the entire financial system would go with them. But here's the theft. From 2000 to 2007, these banks earned record profits. They paid executives billions in bonuses. They paid shareholders billions in dividends. They bought back billions in shares. When the bets went bad, the losses were not borne by the executives who made the decisions, or the shareholders who profited from the risk. The losses were transferred to taxpayers. Profits were private. Losses were socialized. And the bailout was funded by adding to the national debt money borrowed from future taxpayers. The same pattern repeated in 2020. Airlines received $50 billion in COVID relief, despite having spent 96% of free cash flow on stock buybacks from 2010 to 2019. Hotels, restaurants, and corporations received hundreds of billions in Paycheck Protection Program loans, much of it forgiven. The benefits flowed to shareholders and executives. The costs were added to national debt. Thanks for watching. This is Mechanism 4. Transfer corporate losses to taxpayers. Fund the transfer through borrowing. Bill future generations. Another $3 trillion of the $38 trillion debt came from corporate bailouts and subsidies funded through borrowing. 4 mechanisms. $14 trillion from spending without taxing tax cuts and unfunded wars. $8 trillion from Federal Reserve money printing enabling borrowing. $10 trillion from intergenerational transfer, boomers voting for benefits their children will pay for. And $3 trillion from socializing corporate losses. Total. $35 trillion of the $38 trillion can be directly attributed to these 4 mechanisms of theft. The remaining $3 trillion is interest on interest compound debt from borrowing to pay the interest on previous borrowing. This is the final insult. Not only was the principal stolen, but the victims must pay interest on the theft in perpetuity. $38 trillion did not evaporate. It was spent. It went somewhere. To trace the loot is to understand exactly who benefited from the heist and who will pay the price. $8 trillion went to forever wars and military spending. The Iraq War, launched in March 2003 and officially concluded in December 2011, cost $800 billion in direct appropriations. But the true cost, including interest on borrowed money and lifetime care for wounded veterans, exceeds $3 trillion. What did America receive for $3 trillion? Saddam Hussein was removed. Sectarian violence killed hundreds of thousands. ISIS emerged from the chaos. Iran increased its regional influence. And by 2021, Iraq was more aligned with Iran than with the United States. $3 trillion spent, zero strategic benefit achieved. All of it borrowed, all added to the debt. The Afghanistan War, the longest in American history, lasted from October 2001 to August 2021, nearly 20 years. Direct costs exceeded $900 billion. Total costs, including long-term obligations, exceed $2.3 trillion. The outcome, the Taliban, which the United States removed in 2001, returned to power in 2021. Afghanistan looks almost identical to how it looked in 2000, except that America is $2.3 trillion deeper in debt. Add ongoing military spending, $800 billion annually, more than the next 10 countries combined, includes 700 military bases in over 70 countries. 11 aircraft carrier strike groups, more than the rest of the world combined. Advanced weapons systems, many of which the military did not request. The F-35 fighter program alone has a lifetime cost of $1.7 trillion. New Columbia-class submarines will cost $100 billion. The defense budget grows every year, regardless of threat level or strategic need. Who benefited? Defense contractors. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics earn hundreds of billions from government contracts. They lobby over $100 million annually to ensure spending continues and grows. They donate to congressional campaigns. They build facilities in key congressional districts to ensure local representatives support defense budgets. The result: $8 trillion in war and military spending added to the debt, disproportionately benefiting a small number of corporations. $6 trillion went to tax cuts for the wealthy. The Reagan tax cuts of $1,981 and $1,986 dropped the top rate from 70% to 28%. The Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 reduced rates across the board, with most benefits going to top earners. The Trump tax cuts of 2017 reduced the corporate rate from 35% to 21% and provided modest individual cuts that primarily benefit high earners. Each round of cuts was sold as economic stimulus. Each promised to pay for itself through growth. None did. Revenue as a percentage of GDP declined with each round. If federal taxes had remained at 1,980 levels as a share of GDP adjusting for economic growth, cumulative revenue from 1980 to 2024 would have been approximately $6 trillion higher. That $6 trillion in lost revenue was replaced with $6 trillion in additional borrowing. Who benefited? The top 1%. The Congressional Budget Office and Treasury Department analyses consistently show that 60 to 85% of long-term benefits from tax cuts flow to the top quintile, with 40 to 60% going to the top 1% specifically. They received trillions in reduced taxes. The cost was added to the debt. Middle-class taxpayers will service that debt through higher future taxes or reduced benefits. $4 trillion went to healthcare industry subsidies. Medicare and Medicaid cost $1.5 trillion annually. Unlike Social Security, where benefits are earned through payroll taxes, much of healthcare spending is deficit financed. Medicare Part D, added in 2003, prohibited the government from negotiating drug prices, a gift to pharmaceutical companies worth tens of billions annually. The Affordable Care Act included insurance subsidies funded partially through borrowing. Healthcare costs in the United States are 2 to 3 times higher per capita than in other developed nations, yet outcomes are worse. The excess cost, the amount above what comparable countries pay, is pure rent extraction by pharmaceutical companies, hospital systems, and insurance companies. Over 20 years, the cumulative deficit spending on healthcare exceeds $4 trillion. That is money borrowed to pay inflated prices for drugs and procedures that cost half as much elsewhere. Beneficiaries: healthcare industry corporations, which earn record profits while government debt grows. $3 trillion went to corporate bailouts and subsidies. The 2008 TARP program authorized $700 billion for bank bailouts. The Federal Reserve provided trillions more in emergency lending. Citigroup, Bank of America, AIG, and others were rescued from failures caused by their own reckless behavior. Executives who earned millions driving their companies to insolvency kept their jobs and bonuses. Shareholders who profited during the boom were protected from losses during the bust. Taxpayers funded the rescue with borrowed money. In 2020, the COVID pandemic triggered another round of corporate bailouts. Airlines received $50 billion despite having spent years buying back stock instead of maintaining cash reserves. The Paycheck Protection Program distributed $800 billion in loans to businesses, much of which was forgiven. Large corporations with access to credit markets received funds. Small businesses struggled to access the program. The beneficiaries were disproportionately large, politically connected firms. Ongoing subsidies add billions annually. Oil and gas subsidies, agricultural subsidies, export-import bank corporate lending, tax breaks for specific industries. Over 20 years, total corporate welfare exceeds $3 trillion, nearly all of it deficit financed. And $12 trillion, nearly one-third of the total debt, is interest on interest. When you borrow $1 trillion at 4% interest, you owe $40 billion annually in interest payments. If you do not have $40 billion in additional revenue, you must borrow $40 billion more to pay the interest. The following year, you owe interest on the original trillion plus, interest on the $40 billion borrowed to pay last year's interest. This compounds. By year 10, you have borrowed $400 billion just to pay interest. By year 20, over $800 billion. The debt grows exponentially, even if you never borrow another dollar for actual spending. Of the current $38 trillion, approximately $12 trillion represents interest on previous debt, money borrowed solely to pay interest on money previously borrowed. This is the purest form of theft. The original spending at least provided some benefit. However wasteful, the interest spending provides nothing. It is pure transfer from taxpayers to bondholders. $1 trillion per year, growing to $1.8 trillion by 2035, forever, until the system breaks. He's like, in a well-prescended, the 2-7 dot of Gen, in will dot about common and the tableaus in the 7 dot of dot common, the dot about common, the dot about common. Who receives the interest? Foreign governments hold $8 trillion in U.S. debt. China holds approximately $1 trillion. Japan holds $1.2 trillion. They receive roughly $300 billion per year in interest. Wealthy Americans and financial institutions hold most of the rest. The top 10% own 90% of bonds. They receive roughly $700 billion annually in interest income. The middle class pays taxes. The wealthy and foreign governments collect interest. This is reverse redistribution from middle to top, every single year. When you add it together, the picture is clear. $8 trillion to wars that achieve nothing, $6 trillion to tax cuts for the wealthy, $4 trillion to healthcare industry profits, $3 trillion to corporate bailouts, $12 trillion to interest payments, $33 trillion accounted for. The remaining $5 trillion is scattered across discretionary spending, some legitimate, some wasteful, but all of it deficit financed rather than paid for through taxes on the generation that received the benefits. $38 trillion was taken from America's future and handed to defense contractors, wealthy tax cut beneficiaries, healthcare corporations, bailed out banks, and bondholders collecting interest. The loot is not mysterious. The beneficiaries are named, and the victims, Millennials, Gen Z, and the unborn, will spend their entire working lives paying for what was stolen before they could vote to stop it. $38 trillion in debt, $1 trillion in annual interest payments, growing to $1.8 trillion by 2035. Deficits of $2 trillion per year with no plan to reduce them. Debt to GDP ratio at 122% and rising toward 150%. This is not sustainable. The heist cannot continue forever. The mathematics will not allow it. The question is not whether the system breaks. The question is when and which breaking point we hit first. There are 3 possible endings. Each has historical precedent. Each is catastrophic. And all 3 are now more likely than the system continuing unchanged for another generation. Ending 1. Inflation. Slow motion default through currency devaluation. The government cannot cut spending, voters reject it. The government cannot raise taxes enough, politically impossible. The government cannot default explicitly, would end dollar reserve status. But the government can inflate. And inflation is invisible default. Here is how it happens. Federal deficits continue at $2 trillion per year. The Federal Reserve, facing the choice between allowing Treasury bond yields to rise to 8 or 10%, which would make debt service impossible, or resuming quantitative easing, chooses to resume QE. The Fed creates trillions of new dollars and purchases Treasury bonds to keep rates artificially low. The money supply expands 40 to 60% over a decade. Thanks for watching, and really disgrade. If you can really also, the getter on now where lightware completed with move. Prices respond. Sustained inflation of 6 to 8% annually for 10 years. By 2035, prices have doubled. The $38 trillion in nominal debt is now worth only $19 trillion in real terms. The debt burden has been halved, but so has everything else denominated in dollars. Your savings account, your salary, your retirement fund, if it is in bonds or cash, all lose half their value. This is how the debt gets paid, not through taxation, not through cuts, through destroying the currency. Everyone holding dollars pays the price. Those who borrowed at fixed rates benefit their mortgages become trivial in real terms. Those who own hard assets benefit real estate, and stocks inflate with the currency. But the middle class, which holds most wealth in cash, bonds, and wages, is wiped out. Historical precedent. Weimar Germany, where hyperinflation in the 1920 seconds destroyed the middle class and led to political extremism. Argentina, where multiple rounds of currency collapse have created permanent instability. Venezuela, where inflation made the bolivar worthless and drove millions to emigrate. The United States, if it chooses this path, will devastate the middle class to service debt run up by previous generations. Ending 2. Austerity. Forced cuts when borrowing becomes impossible. At some point, markets lose faith. Bond buyers demand 7, 8, 10% interest rates to compensate for risk. The government cannot afford that interest costs would immediately consume 40% of revenue, the historical breaking point. Spain reached this point in 1598 and defaulted. France reached it in 1789 and had a revolution. Greece reached it in 2010 and required bailout. When the U.S. reaches this point, likely within 15 to 20 years, if current trajectory continues, borrowing stops. Deficits must be eliminated immediately. $2 trillion in annual deficits must become zero overnight. The cuts required are beyond severe. Current spending, $4.5 trillion in mandatory programs. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest, $4.5 trillion in revenue. Discretionary spending, defense, education, everything else is currently funded entirely through borrowing. Option 1, eliminate all discretionary spending. Close every military base. Shut down every federal agency except Social Security Administration, CMS, and Treasury. $0 for defense, FBI, national parks, infrastructure, education. Option 2, cut mandatory spending. Social Security benefits reduced 40% immediately. Medicare rationed many procedures no longer covered. Medicaid slashed, millions lose coverage. Defense cut 50%, cannot maintain global presence. This is not theory. This is arithmetic. When borrowing stops, this is what balancing the budget requires. The social consequences would be catastrophic. Riots in the streets, as occurred in Greece when austerity was imposed. Elderly poverty rates would skyrocket. Healthcare crises would overwhelm hospitals. Defense collapse would invite international challenges. Political system would face legitimacy crisis. Historical precedent. Greece, from 2010 to 2015, experienced 25% unemployment, 50% youth unemployment, mass emigration, and near revolution after austerity was imposed. The United Kingdom required IMF bailout in 1976 and imposed severe cuts that devastated communities. Argentina in 2001 defaulted and faced years of chaos. The United States is larger, but the mathematics are the same. When debt becomes unsustainable and borrowing stops, austerity is brutal. Ending 3. Explicit default, the nightmare scenario. The government announces it cannot pay. Bondholders receive 50 cents on the dollar, or 30 cents, or nothing at all. This would be unprecedented for a reserve currency, but not for nations. Russia defaulted in 1998. Argentina defaulted in 2001. Greece came within hours of default in 2015. The immediate consequences of U.S. default would be global financial collapse. The dollar underpins the international financial system. U.S. Treasury bonds are considered the safest asset in the world. Trillions are held by central banks, pension funds, insurance companies as reserves. If those bonds default, the entire structure collapses. Stock markets would crash 60 to 80%. Banks, which hold treasuries as safe assets, would fail. Pension funds would be wiped out. International trade would freeze. No one trusts counterparties if the dollar is worthless. Unemployment would reach Great Depression levels, 20 to 30%. The United States would face depression lasting years or decades. And politically, default would mean the end of American global leadership. The dollar would lose reserve status immediately. U.S. could not borrow internationally for a generation. Federal government would shrink to levels not seen since the 1800s. States would be on their own. The American century would be over. Historical precedent. Russia, after 1998 default, took a decade to recover. Argentina, after 2001 default, faced years of poverty and instability. The United States would not recover quickly from default. It would be generational catastrophe. 3 endings: inflation, austerity, or default. All 3 result in the same outcome. The victims of the heist, millennials, Gen Z, and future generations will pay the price that boomers, Gen X, politicians, and corporate interests avoided. If inflation, your savings are destroyed. If austerity, your benefits are slashed. If default, your economy collapses. The generation that looted $38 trillion will die comfortably. The generation that inherits the debt will live through crisis. This is not speculation. This is mathematics. Debt to GDP cannot exceed 150% without crisis. Interest costs cannot exceed 40% of revenue without default. The United States is on track to hit both thresholds within 15 to 20 years. The only question is which breaking point comes first and how the political system responds when it does. Can the heist be stopped? Technically, yes. Politically, no. To stabilize the debt would require eliminating the $2 trillion annual deficit. This could be done through some combination of spending cuts and tax increases. One scenario? Cut spending by $1 trillion, 20%, across the board. Cut to all programs including Social Security and Medicare. And raise taxes by $1 trillion, 40% tax increase on all brackets. This would stop the bleeding. But this will not happen. 70% of voters oppose cutting Social Security or Medicare. 60% oppose significant tax increases. Any politician proposing this loses re-election immediately. The political system is designed to prevent fiscal responsibility. Democracy, when voters demand benefits they refuse to fund, becomes a mechanism for looting the future. The heist will continue until the mathematics force a stop. And when that happens, those who looted the politicians, the Fed governors, the boomers who voted for benefits they would not fund, will be long gone. Those who pay the young, the unborn, the future never had a choice. The $38 trillion heist is not a historical event. It is ongoing. $1 trillion is added to the debt every 90 days. $1 trillion in interest is paid to bondholders every year. The looting continues every single day, and it will continue until the system breaks. We have answered the question: who looted America's future? Politicians from both parties who spent without taxing. The Federal Reserve that printed money to enable unlimited borrowing. Interest groups that lobbied for spending that benefited them and added to debt for everyone. Voters who demanded benefits without costs. And especially baby boomers who voted themselves trillions in benefits and left the bill to their children and grandchildren. The loot went to wars that achieved nothing. Tax cuts for the wealthy, healthcare industry profits, corporate bailouts, and interest payments to bondholders. $38 trillion stolen from the future and handed to the present. The largest theft in human history. And it is legal, documented, ongoing, and unstoppable through democratic process. The victims will pay, the perpetrators will escape consequences. And when the system finally breaks, the nation that emerged from the heist will not resemble the nation that existed before it. America's future was not lost. It was stolen. And now you know exactly who took it.